The Milwaukee County Courthouse stood tall and imposing on a chilly October morning in 2019. The marble halls echoed with footsteps as James Richardson, a 68-year-old Vietnam veteran, wheeled himself toward courtroom 304. His weathered hands, strong from decades of pushing his wheelchair, gripped the wheels with determination. As he approached the security checkpoint, the guards exchanged knowing looks. They had seen thousands of self-represented litigants come through these doors, most of them leaving disappointed. One of the younger guards stepped forward to assist, but Richardson politely declined with a gentle smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I've been navigating these halls for longer than you've been alive, son," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of experience. The guard nodded respectfully, noticing the Vietnam veteran pin on Richardson's meticulously pressed navy blue suit. Inside courtroom 304, the atmosphere was tense. Judge Karen Mitchell, recently appointed to the bench after a career in corporate law, was already developing a reputation for her impatience with self-represented litigants. At 45, she was one of the youngest judges in the county, and many whispered that her rapid rise to the bench had more to do with political connections than experience. The clerk announced the case: Richardson versus Milwaukee Property Development Corporation. The courtroom was unusually full that morning. Several young law students had come to observe the proceedings, their notebooks ready. They had no idea they were about to witness something extraordinary. Richardson wheeled himself to the plaintiff's table with practiced ease. His opponent, represented by the prestigious Johnson and Myers law firm, sat across the aisle. Three expensive-suited lawyers shuffled their papers, occasionally glancing at Richardson with barely concealed smirks. Judge Mitchell entered, and everyone rose, except Richardson, who simply straightened his posture in his wheelchair. The judge's eyes narrowed slightly at this, though protocol clearly excused those who couldn't stand. As she sat down, she peered over her reading glasses at Richardson. "Mr. Richardson," she began, her tone dripping with condescension, "I see you've chosen to represent yourself in this matter. Are you aware that this is a complex property dispute involving multiple municipal codes and state regulations?" Richardson nodded calmly. "Yes, Your Honor, I am aware." "And you still think you can handle this without proper legal representation?" She emphasized the word proper while shuffling through the case files, not even bothering to look at him. The law students in the gallery exchanged uncomfortable glances. One of them whispered to another, "Is she allowed to speak to him like that?" Richardson remained composed, his hands folded neatly on the table before him. "If it pleases the court, I believe I can adequately present my case." Judge Mitchell sighed dramatically. "Very well. Don't expect this court to explain basic legal procedures to you. We have a full docket today, and I won't have time to give you a crash course in law school basics." A few muffled gasps came from the gallery. The older bailiff, who had worked in the courthouse for decades, shifted uncomfortably. He had seen Richardson before, but he couldn't quite place where or when. Richardson simply nodded again, reaching into his briefcase to retrieve his documents. His movements were precise and organized, each paper in its proper place. The opposing counsel whispered among themselves, already planning how to quickly dismiss this seemingly amateur opponent. "Your Honor," Richardson began, his voice clear and steady, "before we proceed, I'd like to address the court's concern about my qualifications." He paused, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "Perhaps we should first discuss the relevant precedent set in Anderson v. Milwaukee County, 1985, regarding property easements in historical districts." Judge Mitchell's hand, which had been reaching for her coffee cup, froze midair. The opposing counsel's lead attorney sat up straighter, his smirk fading slightly. That case wasn't widely known. It had been a complex decision that only specialized property lawyers typically referenced. The judge recovered quickly, though a hint of uncertainty had crept into her voice. "Proceed, Mr. Richardson, but please be brief." As Richardson began his opening statement, one of the court clerks was quietly typing something into her computer, her eyes widening at whatever she found. She hastily scribbled a note and passed it to the bailiff. The morning sun streamed through the high courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the floor. Nobody in that courtroom, except perhaps Richardson himself, realized that they were about to witness one of the most remarkable legal proceedings in the county's recent history. Judge Mitchell's interruptions began almost immediately as Richardson started presenting his case. Her impatience was evident in every tap of her pen against the bench and every exaggerated sigh. The opposing counsel, led by senior partner Thomas Blake, sat back with an air of smug satisfaction as the judge repeatedly cut off Richardson's statements. "Mr. Richardson," Judge Mitchell interrupted for the third time in 5 minutes. "We don't need a history lesson about property law. Please get to the point." She adjusted her glasses, looking down at him with barely concealed disdain. Richardson paused mid-sentence, his hands resting calmly on his legal pad. The law students in the gallery had stopped taking notes, too engrossed in the unfolding drama. One of them was quietly recording the proceedings on her phone, sensing that something unusual was happening. "Your Honor," Richardson responded, his voice maintaining its steady professional tone. "If you'll allow me to continue, that historical context is crucial to understanding the application of Section 453.2 of the Municipal Code." The judge waved her hand dismissively. "Mr. Richardson, I'm quite familiar with the Municipal Code. I don't need." "Then you'll recall," Richardson continued smoothly, "the amendments made in 1992 following the landmark case of Peterson v. City Council." His eyes met hers directly, challenging but respectful. A flicker of uncertainty crossed Judge Mitchell's face. That case wasn't in her mental database, and she prided herself on her knowledge of property law. The opposing counsel, Mr. Blake, was frantically flipping through his notes. Meanwhile, the note that the clerk had passed to the bailiff was making its way through several hands. The courthouse staff were beginning to whisper among themselves. The older bailiff's eyes had widened in recognition, and he was now watching the proceedings with intense interest. "Your Honor," Blake stood up, attempting to seize the moment. "We move to dismiss this case on the grounds of insufficient evidence. Mr. Richardson clearly lacks the expertise to." "Objection," Richardson called out firmly. "Mr. Blake's motion is premature, and if he'd reviewed Travis v. Henderson County, he'd know that such a motion at this stage is procedurally improper." The judge's coffee cup clattered slightly as she set it down. Travis v. Henderson County was a complex case that had only been cited 3 times in the state's history. How did this seemingly amateur litigant know about it? The young law students in the gallery were now furiously Googling the cases Richardson had mentioned. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to amazement as they read their search results. "Mr. Richardson," Judge Mitchell began, her tone slightly less confident, "while I appreciate your enthusiasm for legal precedent, this court's time is valuable if you can't present your evidence concisely." "I have here," Richardson interrupted gently, pulling out a thick folder, "documented evidence of systematic property right violations spanning the last 15 years. Each incident is cross-referenced with applicable state statutes and relevant case law." He began laying out the documents with military precision. The opposing counsel team huddled together, whispering urgently. Blake's forehead was beginning to show beads of sweat. This was not the easy victory they had anticipated. Judge Mitchell leaned forward, squinting at the meticulously organized documents. Her eyes widened as she scanned the first page. The research was impeccable, the citations perfect, the arguments structured with a precision she had rarely seen even from top law firms. Just then, her clerk approached the bench with another note. As she read it, the color drained from her face. Her hands, usually steady, trembled slightly as she set the paper down. The note contained Richardson's background check. It revealed that before his military service, he had graduated top of his class from Harvard Law School in 1975. He had argued before the state Supreme Court multiple times and had won landmark cases that were now taught in law schools across the country. The courtroom had fallen completely silent. Even the usual shuffle of papers had ceased. Everyone sensed that something extraordinary was unfolding, though only a few were beginning to understand what it was. Richardson wheeled himself slightly closer to the bench. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "shall I continue with my presentation of evidence?" Judge Mitchell swallowed hard, suddenly very aware of the numerous eyes watching her. Her earlier condescension hung heavily in the air, and she realized with growing dread that she had severely misjudged the man before her. "Please proceed, Mr. Richardson," she said, her voice notably more subdued. "The court is listening." Richardson's revelation of his legal expertise began to unfold like a masterfully played chess game. Each move was calculated, each citation perfect, as he began presenting his case with the skill of a seasoned attorney. The opposing counsel's earlier smugness had completely evaporated, replaced by growing concern. If we examine the property records from 2005 to 2020, Richardson stated, pulling out a series of carefully marked documents, we can see a clear pattern of systematic discrimination against disabled property owners. His fingers moved swiftly through the papers, despite their age-worn appearance. The law students in the gallery were now hanging on his every word. One of them whispered to another, I think that's the James Richardson. My constitutional law professor mentioned him last semester. Judge Mitchell, trying to regain her composure, leaned forward. Mr. Richardson, these are serious allegations against a respected development corporation. Indeed they are, Your Honor, Richardson replied, his voice carrying the weight of decades of courtroom experience. Which is why I prepared a comprehensive analysis of similar cases across 3 different circuits. He produced another set of documents, each page annotated with precise legal references. Thomas Blake, the lead counsel for the Development Corporation, stood up abruptly. Your Honor, we object to these last-minute submissions. We haven't had time to review. Counselor, Richardson interrupted calmly, all these documents were included in the discovery package sent to your office 6 weeks ago. Page 47 of your acknowledgement shows your signature. He held up the relevant paper without even having to search for it. Blake sat down heavily, his face reddening. His junior associates were frantically searching through their files, confirming Richardson's statement. The courthouse staff had stopped pretending to work on other tasks. The clerk who had discovered Richardson's background was now sharing the information with her colleagues. The whispers spread through the courtroom like wildfire. He argued Cooper v. State in '82. Wrote the brief for the Veterans Rights Act. Top civil rights attorney before Vietnam. Richardson continued his presentation, seamlessly weaving together state statutes, federal regulations, and constitutional principles. His argument was building like a perfectly constructed legal pyramid, each point supporting the next. Your Honor, he said, reaching into his briefcase once more, I'd like to direct the court's attention to the Supreme Court's decision in Matthews v. Henderson, particularly Justice Roberts' concurrent opinion on property rights for disabled citizens. Judge Mitchell's eyes widened. She had read that case during her judicial preparation, but Richardson was citing parts she hadn't even noticed. His analysis was opening new perspectives on the legal precedent. The opposing counsel's table looked like they were watching a train wreck in slow motion. Their carefully prepared defense strategy was being systematically dismantled by a man they had dismissed as an amateur just an hour ago. Furthermore, Richardson continued, his voice growing stronger, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Section 504, when read in conjunction with local zoning laws, clearly establishes. He paused, noting something in Judge Mitchell's expression. Would Your Honor like me to provide citations for these interpretations? Judge Mitchell, who had been scribbling notes frantically, looked up. No, Mr. Richardson, that won't be necessary. Your knowledge of the relevant statutes is quite comprehensive. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting different shadows now. The atmosphere in the courtroom had completely transformed. What had started as a seemingly routine case had turned into a masterclass in legal argumentation. Richardson's wheelchair no longer seemed to be what defined him in the eyes of those present. Instead, it was his commanding knowledge of the law, his precise delivery, and his dignified presence that held everyone's attention. One of the senior lawyers watching from the gallery whispered to his colleague, I haven't seen anything like this since the state Supreme Court hearings of '95. As Richardson prepared to present his next set of arguments, Judge Mitchell's earlier condescension seemed like a distant memory. The power dynamic in the courtroom had shifted dramatically, and everyone could feel it. Your Honor, Richardson said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had spent a lifetime mastering his craft. Shall I proceed with the constitutional implications of this case? Judge Mitchell nodded, now paying complete attention to every word. The morning's mockery had transformed into a lesson in humility, justice, and the danger of making assumptions. And Richardson was just getting started. The note that had been circulating through the courthouse finally made its way back to Judge Mitchell's bench, accompanied by additional pages of research. Her clerk, Sarah Martinez, had done a thorough background check on Richardson, As the judge read through the documents, her hands trembled slightly. James Richardson wasn't just any lawyer, he was a legal legend. Before his military service, he had won 47 consecutive civil rights cases. He had argued before the Supreme Court multiple times and had written legal textbooks that were still used in law schools across the country. The property law handbook sitting on her own shelf had a foreword written by him. "Mr. Richardson," Judge Mitchell said, her voice noticeably softer, "I believe we should take a 15-minute recess." She needed time to process this information and compose herself. As the court adjourned briefly, the opposing counsel team huddled in panic. Thomas Blake's face was ashen as he whispered to his associates, "How did we miss this? Someone pull up everything we can find on his previous cases." The law students in the gallery were busy sharing their discoveries on their phones. One of them had found an old law review article about Richardson's landmark cases in the 1980s. Another had discovered his military service record, 2 Purple Hearts and a Silver Star from Vietnam. Richardson simply sat quietly at his table, reviewing his notes. An elderly gentleman in the gallery approached him during the break. "Jim? Jim Richardson?" the man asked hesitantly. "You probably don't remember me, but you helped my family keep our farm in '83. That case you won against the big developers." Richardson looked up and smiled warmly. "The Anderson case. Of course I remember, George. How's the farm doing?" More people began gathering around Richardson's table, each with a story to tell. The courtroom was buzzing with whispered conversations as more of his history came to light. When Judge Mitchell returned to the bench, her entire demeanor had changed. Gone was the condescending attitude, replaced by genuine respect and attention. She had spent the recess reading about the man before her and was now acutely aware of her earlier mistake. "Mr. Richardson," she began, "please continue with your argument regarding the constitutional implications." Richardson nodded and picked up exactly where he had left off. "Your Honor, the intersection of property rights and disability access has been a contentious issue since the landmark case of Douglas P. City Council in 1979. He paused, a slight smile crossing his face. "A case, I should mention, that I had the privilege of arguing before Justice Marshall." The opposing counsel team looked like they wanted to disappear. Their client, the CEO of Milwaukee Property Development Corporation, had arrived during the recess and was now sitting behind them, his face growing increasingly concerned as he watched Richardson's masterful presentation. "The precedent established in that case," Richardson continued, "when applied to our current situation, clearly shows." His voice remained steady and authoritative as he laid out complex legal principles in terms everyone could understand. Judge Mitchell was now taking detailed notes, hanging on every word. Several times she asked insightful questions, engaging in the kind of high-level legal discussion she had always dreamed of having in her courtroom. The gallery had grown even more crowded. Word had spread through the courthouse, and other lawyers had come to watch. Among them was the district court chief judge, who stood quietly at the back, observing with great interest. Furthermore, Richardson said, pulling out another document, "I have here the original draft of the 1992 Municipal Code Amendments." He smiled slightly. "I still had my copy from when I served on the advisory committee that wrote them." The opposing counsel's last hope of finding a technical flaw in Richardson's argument vanished. They were up against someone who hadn't just studied the law, he had helped write it. Judge Mitchell glanced at the clock, realizing that what she had expected to be a quick dismissal of a pro se case had turned into one of the most remarkable legal presentations she had ever witnessed. "Your Honor," Richardson said, sensing her thoughts, "I realize we've spent considerable time on these points. However, given the importance of the constitutional issues at stake—" "Please continue, Mr. Richardson," Judge Mitchell replied, her tone now carrying genuine respect. "The court will give this case all the time it requires." The morning's mockery had transformed into an impromptu masterclass in constitutional law, delivered by a man who had once been one of its most distinguished practitioners. And he wasn't finished yet. The turning point in the proceedings came when Richardson began presenting evidence of systemic discrimination against disabled property owners. His wheelchair, which had earlier drawn Judge Mitchell's condescending looks, now seemed to represent something entirely different. A testament to his personal stake in the fight for equal rights. "Your Honor," Richardson said, pulling out a well-worn manila folder, I would like to present evidence of similar cases spanning the last 3 decades. His voice carried the weight of personal experience. Each of these cases represents someone who faced discrimination but lacked the legal knowledge to fight back. The CEO of Milwaukee Property Development Corporation shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He leaned forward and whispered urgently to Thomas Blake, who shook his head helplessly. Their position was crumbling with each new piece of evidence Richardson presented. In 1985, Richardson continued, "I represented a group of disabled veterans in a similar case." He paused, his hands resting on his wheelchair arms. "That was my last case before I went to Vietnam. When I returned, I found that many of the same discriminatory practices had continued, just in more subtle forms." Judge Mitchell's transformation was now complete. She listened intently, her earlier arrogance replaced by genuine engagement with the legal principles being discussed. Several times she asked thoughtful questions, leading to deep discussions about property law and civil rights. "Mr. Richardson," she said during one such exchange, "your interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause in this context is fascinating. Have you published any articles on this specific issue?" Richardson smiled slightly. "Actually, Your Honor, if you check the Harvard Law Review, spring edition of 1978, you'll find my analysis of property rights and equal protection. I believe it's still cited in some current textbooks." Thomas Blake, the opposing counsel, had given up trying to object. His legal pad was filled with frantic notes, but every argument he could think of had already been anticipated and countered in Richardson's presentation. The gallery had grown so full that people were standing along the walls. Word had spread through the legal community, and several prominent attorneys had come to witness what was becoming a legendary courtroom performance. "Your Honor," Richardson said, reaching the core of his argument, "the Development Corporation's pattern of buying properties and making them inaccessible to disabled residents isn't just morally wrong. It's a clear violation of both federal and state law." He wheeled himself slightly closer to the judge's bench. "I have here satellite images showing how the corporation systematically removed wheelchair ramps and accessibility features from properties after purchase." His hands moved efficiently through his documents, presenting each piece of evidence with precision. The CEO was now openly conferring with his legal team. The whispered conversation seemed heated, with Blake repeatedly shaking his head and gesturing at his notes. Judge Mitchell examined the satellite images carefully. "Mr. Richardson, this evidence is compelling. How did you manage to compile all this documentation? When you've been fighting these battles as long as I have, Your Honor, you learn to keep thorough records." Richardson's voice carried no bitterness, only determination. "Each of these images tells the story of someone who lost their home or their independence." The afternoon sun now streamed through the courtroom windows, casting long shadows across the floor. The atmosphere had completely transformed from the morning's confrontational beginning. Now it felt more like a historic moment in the making. One of the law students in the gallery raised her hand. Forgetting this wasn't a lecture hall, Judge Mitchell, surprisingly, acknowledged her. "Yes," the judge asked. "Your Honor," the student said nervously, "isn't this the same Mr. Richardson who wrote Equal Justice Under Law, A Modern Perspective?" Richardson turned slightly in his wheelchair, offering a modest smile. "That was a long time ago, young lady, but I'm glad to see they're still using it in law schools." Judge Mitchell's eyes widened further. That book had been instrumental in her own legal education. She had quoted from it during her judicial confirmation hearings, never imagining she would one day have its author in her courtroom. The case was far from over, but the momentum had shifted decisively. What had started as a seemingly routine property dispute had evolved into a masterclass in constitutional law and civil rights, delivered by a man who had helped shape those very principles. Richardson gathered his next set of documents, ready to continue. The courthouse staff, the gallery, and even the opposing counsel watched in anticipation, knowing they were witnessing something extraordinary. As the afternoon session continued, Richardson's professional legacy began to emerge in full detail. The courthouse staff had compiled a comprehensive file of his career achievements, which now sat on Judge Mitchell's bench. Each page revealed another layer of his remarkable legal career. "Before my military service," Richardson explained, responding to the judge's inquiry, "I established the Midwest Veterans Legal Clinic." His voice carried a hint of pride, not for himself, but for the work accomplished. We provided free legal services to veterans and their families. At our peak, we handled over 300 cases annually. The CEO of Milwaukee Property Development Corporation was now frantically writing notes to his legal team. The case had evolved far beyond what anyone had anticipated, and his company's reputation was at stake. The clinic, Richardson continued, pulling out more documentation, handled many cases similar to this one. We saw a pattern of discrimination that continues to this day. He presented a thick folder of case histories, each one meticulously documented. Judge Mitchell leafed through the files, her expression growing more serious with each page. Mr. Richardson, these cases span 3 decades. You've been tracking this issue all this time? Yes, Your Honor. Even after my injury in Vietnam, I continued to collect evidence. He gestured to the wheelchair. My circumstances gave me a new perspective on the challenges disabled individuals face in property matters. The gallery had grown completely silent. Among the observers was a reporter from the Milwaukee Journal, furiously taking notes. This wasn't just a court case anymore. It was becoming a story about justice, perseverance, and the long arc of civil rights advocacy. Thomas Blake, the opposing counsel, finally stood up. Your Honor, in light of Mr. Richardson's evidence, we would like to request a brief recess to confer with our client. His voice carried the resignation of someone who knew they were fighting a losing battle. Before we break, Richardson interjected politely. I'd like to submit one more piece of evidence. He produced a leather-bound volume. This is the original proposal for the Veterans Housing Protection Act of 1982. I helped draft it while recovering at the VA hospital. Judge Mitchell's eyes widened. That act had revolutionized housing rights for disabled veterans. She had studied it in law school, never knowing its origins in a VA hospital room. One of the older attorneys in the gallery spoke up unexpectedly. Jim Richardson, I thought I recognized you. You helped my brother with his disability claim in '89. He still lives in that house today. More voices joined in, each with a story about Richardson's impact on their lives or the lives of their family members. The courtroom briefly filled with murmured conversations as people shared their connections to his work. The CEO of the development corporation looked increasingly uncomfortable. His company's actions, when viewed against Richardson's decades of advocacy, appeared not just legally questionable but morally indefensible. Your Honor, Richardson said, his voice cutting through the murmurs, these are not just legal arguments we're discussing today. These are people's lives, their homes, their dignity. He wheeled himself slightly forward. I've spent my career fighting for these rights, first in a suit and tie, then in uniform, and now from this chair. Judge Mitchell nodded slowly, her earlier condescension completely forgotten. Mr. Richardson, your dedication to justice is remarkable. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I believe we could all learn from your example. A young law clerk approached the bench with yet another document, an old newspaper article from 1981. It showed a younger Richardson, standing tall in his lawyer's suit, surrounded by veterans whose homes he had helped save from developers. The contrast between that image and the man before them now was striking, but what hadn't changed was the fierce determination in his eyes and his unwavering commitment to justice. We'll take that recess now, Judge Mitchell announced. 20 minutes. She looked directly at the Development Corporation's legal team. I suggest you use this time wisely, gentlemen. As people began filing out of the courtroom, Richardson remained at his table, organizing his documents with military precision. His fight wasn't just about winning a case anymore. It was about continuing a lifetime's work of ensuring justice for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The afternoon sun cast long shadows through the courthouse windows, and the weight of history seemed to fill the room. Everyone present knew they were witnessing not just a legal proceeding, but the culmination of a career dedicated to justice and equality. When court resumed after the recess, the atmosphere had changed dramatically. The opposing counsel team, led by Thomas Blake, Mr. Richardson, Blake said quietly, our client would like to propose a settlement. His voice carried a mix of respect and resignation. We're prepared to meet all your demands, plus establish a fund for future accessibility improvements. Richardson looked up from his notes, studying Blake's face carefully. And the other affected properties? The ones not directly involved in this case. The CEO of Milwaukee Property Development Corporation stepped forward himself. We're prepared to review all our properties, Mr. Richardson. Full accessibility upgrades wherever needed. He paused, glancing around the courtroom. And we'd like to offer you a position on our advisory board for disability compliance. Judge Mitchell returned to the bench, observing the discussion with interest. The gallery fell silent, waiting to see how Richardson would respond to the offer. Your Honor, Richardson began, wheeling himself back into position. The defendants have proposed a settlement. His voice remained steady and professional. However, I believe we need to ensure this agreement becomes a matter of public record. The judge nodded, understanding the significance of his request. A public record would make the agreement enforceable and set a precedent for future cases. Very well, she said. Please present the terms for the court's review. Over the next hour, Richardson meticulously outlined the settlement terms. The agreement went far beyond his original demands, including immediate restoration of all removed accessibility features, a $5 million fund for future improvements, mandatory disability awareness training for all company employees, regular compliance audits by independent inspectors, a written apology to all affected residents. The CEO signed each page without objection, knowing that fighting further would only damage his company's reputation more severely. What happened next surprised everyone. Richardson pulled out one final document, a detailed proposal for a citywide accessibility initiative. Your Honor, he said, his voice carrying decades of experience. While this settlement addresses the immediate issues, I believe we have an opportunity to prevent similar situations in the future. Judge Mitchell leaned forward, intrigued. Please elaborate, Mr. Richardson. This initiative would establish clear guidelines for property developers throughout Milwaukee County. It would ensure that accessibility isn't just an afterthought, but a fundamental part of every development project. The gallery buzzed with whispered conversations. Several city council members who had come to watch the proceedings were taking detailed notes. Furthermore, Richardson continued, I propose that the defendant's compliance fund be used as seed money for a broader community initiative. Let's turn this case into something that benefits the entire city. Judge Mitchell looked at the proposal, then at the CEO, who nodded in agreement. The company's earlier resistance had transformed into an opportunity for positive change. The court accepts these terms, Judge Mitchell announced, her voice carrying official authority. Mr. Richardson, your dedication to justice extends far beyond this individual case. This court commends your vision for lasting change. As she signed the final order, spontaneous applause broke out in the gallery. The law students who had witnessed the entire proceedings were on their feet, joined by practicing attorneys, courthouse staff, and even the opposing counsel team. Richardson remained composed, gathering his documents with the same careful precision he had shown throughout the day. The victory wasn't just about winning a case, it was about continuing the work he had started decades ago. Judge Mitchell stepped down from the bench and approached Richardson's table, an unusual move that demonstrated her complete transformation from their morning encounter. Mr. Richardson, she said quietly, I owe you an apology for my earlier behavior. You taught this court a valuable lesson about prejudice and presumption. Richardson looked up at her with gentle understanding. Your Honor, the best outcomes often come from our most humbling moments. I learned that in Vietnam, and I've seen it proven true in this courtroom many times. As the courthouse began to empty, the afternoon sun cast a warm glow through the windows. What had started as a simple property dispute had become a landmark moment in the city's legal history, all because of a disabled veteran who refused to be dismissed or underestimated. The case was over, but its impact was just beginning. And James Richardson, having won yet another victory for justice, quietly wheeled himself out of the courtroom, already thinking about the next battle that needed to be fought. The aftermath of Richardson's courtroom victory rippled through Milwaukee's legal community like waves in a pond. Within a week of the settlement, Judge Karen Mitchell took unprecedented steps to address what had happened in her courtroom. My treatment of Mr. Richardson revealed biases I didn't know I harbored, she admitted, her voice carrying genuine remorse. From today forward, this courthouse will implement new training. The Milwaukee Property Development Corporation kept its word. Construction crews were visible across the city, installing ramps, widening doorways, and upgrading facilities. the CEO, transformed by the experience, became an unexpected advocate for disability rights in the business community. But the most significant changes were happening in a small office near the VA hospital. Richardson had converted his old legal clinic into a training center for disability rights advocacy. Law students from across the state came to learn from him, sitting in folding chairs as he shared decades of legal wisdom. The law, he would tell them, wheeling between the rows of eager faces, is not just about statutes and precedents. It's about people. Never forget that behind every case file is a human being fighting for their dignity. 1 month after the case, Judge Mitchell visited the training center. She sat quietly in the back, watching Richardson teach a new generation of lawyers. During a break, she approached him. "You've turned our confrontation into a catalyst for change," she said, gesturing to the bustling classroom. "How do you do it? How do you take setbacks and turn them into opportunities?" Richardson smiled, the same gentle expression he had shown in her courtroom. "In Vietnam, I learned that surviving isn't enough. You have to keep moving forward, keep fighting for what's right. This wheelchair taught me the same lesson all over again." The local bar association created a new annual award in Richardson's honor, the Richardson Award for Excellence in Civil Rights Advocacy. Judge Mitchell insisted on being the one to present it to him at the first ceremony. The law students who had witnessed the original case started a disability rights clinic at their law school, naming it after Richardson. They'd often invited him to speak, and he never refused, believing that each new lawyer educated meant another voice for justice. The courthouse itself underwent changes. New accessibility guidelines were implemented, and sensitivity training became mandatory for all judicial staff. The old bailiff who had recognized Richardson now gave tours to school groups, always stopping to tell the story of the day a judge learned not to judge by appearances. 6 months after the case, Richardson received an invitation to speak at the National Conference of State Court Judges. His topic: Beyond the Bench, Building a More Inclusive Justice System. The same judges who had once dismissed disabled litigants now took notes as he spoke. But perhaps the most touching aftermath came from the individual letters that began arriving at Richardson's office. Veterans, disabled civilians, and their families wrote to share their stories and ask for guidance. He answered every letter personally, often working late into the night. One evening, as he finished responding to the day's mail, a young lawyer knocked on his door. It was one of the students who had witnessed the original case. "Mr. Richardson," she said, "I've been offered a position with a big corporate law firm. The salary is amazing," but she hesitated. "I keep thinking about what you said about justice being about people, not just laws." Richardson wheeled himself around his desk. "Sometimes," he said softly, "the biggest impact we can make isn't in the highest paying job, but in the places where people need us most." The young lawyer nodded, understanding. The next day, she accepted a position with a nonprofit disability rights organization instead. As the 1-year anniversary of the case approached, the Milwaukee County Courthouse installed a small plaque outside courtroom 304. It read, "Justice sees beyond appearances," in honor of James Richardson, who taught us all to do the same. Richardson never mentioned the plaque when he visited the courthouse, which he still did regularly. He would wheel past it quietly, focused on his next case, his next student, his next battle for justice. Because for him, the greatest aftermath of that day wasn't in the physical changes or public recognition, but in the countless lives that would be touched by the ripples of change he had set in motion. The wheelchair that had once drawn Judge Mitchell's scorn had become a symbol of perseverance, wisdom, and the enduring fight for justice. And James Richardson kept rolling forward, showing everyone that true authority comes not from a position or title, but from the unwavering pursuit of what's right.